if you could just tell me your name and what your title would be.
Yeah, my name is Max Corsi, and I am an associate broker and realtor. I'm the founder of Tiger Prop, which is now part of Homes of Idaho. We're the real estate company that gives buyers money instead of fruit baskets, and we refuse to charge 6% brokerage fees. We're kind of famous for that. We've given or saved clients over $1 million when compared to 6% brokers.
Now, recently you had an interesting listing. You listed a home for a client, and you did something you think was probably the first in Idaho and likely maybe the first listing in the United States.
Yeah, I think it's the first listing in Idaho and potentially the first listing in the United States that gives the buyer the unobstructed ability to negotiate the buyer brokerage fee. And I know that's a very bold statement, but I think in the past, because of the way that N.A.R. rules, MLS rules, and other state and local association rules are, that opportunity was not afforded to the buyer in the past. And I think that I figured out a way to circumvent all of these rules and working with the seller to be able to offer the buyer for potentially the first time the ability to negotiate all of those brokerage fees on the buyer side. Why wait until July? Take advantage of the Department of Justice and class action settlements. You can be a part of history in what is likely the nation's first listing of its kind. Take an extra 3% off your purchase price, or use the money to pay your buyer's agent and/or closing costs. Seller to pay up to 3% towards buyer's closing costs, prepaids, buyer side brokerage fees, or purchase price reduction. Buyer's choice.
So what was kind of the result on your end? Was there kind of some reaction from the MLS?
Yeah, there was a reaction from the MLS who
Dude, so we are editing this thing right now, and you received an email. What did that email say? And then you looked at your listing, and what had happened?
Well, the email was essentially a fine for me for violating an MLS rule. I'm still not clear what the violation was, but they sent me a $250 bill. The first time I've ever heard of this in my life, the Intermountain MLS actually went into my listing, which I had a signed agreement with my seller to make this offering, and they changed my listing. They changed the offering that my seller offered the buyer.
Good evening, Max. This is Glenn Christoph with Intermountain MLS. I don't think we've had a conversation in the past, but I've heard of you and heard of your leadership with Ada County, and also been on the threads with the various listing What we see is a rule issue per N.A.R. per our charter to keep our charter and Boise Regional to keep the charter, we have to abide by their rules. Again, and I know you've heard of the new rule that may come out in July, but has not been approved.
Now let's talk about the rules, and there's two in particular. The first is that we will be changing the rule that will prohibit the offer of cooperating compensation on the MLS.
It gets even tighter on compensation. The broker remarks are not a venue to display a different company. It's supposed to be for the listing, describing the listing, and that's the whole basis of the original. And the violation is it's your remarks and public are not describing the property. Remarks and public are not describing the property. They're describing a possible issue that's going to come out in July from N.A.R.
Now, let's turn to another term of the agreement. As you know, N.A.R. has agreed to put in place a new rule prohibiting offers of compensation on the MLS. And sellers can offer concessions on an MLS, for example, concessions for buyer closing costs, via the MLS, provided that such concessions are not conditioned on the use of or payment to a buyer broker.
Which again, we'll have to abide by N.A.R.'s rules if we want to keep our charter, which of course we would, because we back and support the selling of real property. You're more than welcome to give me a call back and discuss this.
Throughout our history, we have evolved to adapt to the ever-changing real estate landscape. This settlement represents a pivotal moment for our association and our industry, and I have full confidence in our ability to evolve once more to do what is needed to lead our members for the years to come.
Good morning.
Hey, Glenn.
Yeah, Matt. I stepped out of a meeting.
Oh, it's Max. This is Max Corsi.
Sorry, Max. I thought I said Matt. I apologize.
Oh, no worries. Where are you at? Are you in Boise?
I'm in Jackson Hole. I'm at I have a designation from a company or an organization called CMLS, and we're having a yearly or it's been 2 years, a get together and more retool on different products or services or just overall day-to-day operations. So
nice. Well, that's a cool place to go work. Go out there and check out the Tetons. Hey, I just wanted to kind of touch base with you on this listing I have on Corona. You're aware, you corresponded, I think we've been CCing each other on emails with you and compliance and Kim and some other people. And I got your voicemail. And I don't want you to lose your charter. And likewise, I don't want to lose MLS access. I mean, this is...
And I'm willing, if we can come to an agreement, I'm willing to go back and pull the 250 off the table and not worry about it. The issue that we have for you or any other
What was
agent...
the 250 for, by the way? Because I still am not clear. At first, you guys said it was... the story kept changing. What was the 250 for?
It's because in the public remarks, there's information that had nothing pertinent to the listing, and that's a fine.
Actually, I think all of the public remarks had pertinent information. What specifically wasn't pertinent?
It was dealing with, I don't have it in front of me, but dealing with the DOJ, don't wait now. There was wording like that had nothing to do with said property, and that's why somebody else, another agent in IMLS, hit the button in Paragon and said, this goes against the rules, and they were right. Not everything, but there's that wording, and that's the wording that we said, hey, we need to take out of the remarks because it goes against our rules. That would have been done for you, which it was, or any other member that we have, because what we're looking for is clean data, and it needs to follow the rules, and that did not. So
why? Can I ask you a question on that? Why did you remove the 3% offering from the seller to the buyer, which was $11,666?
I didn't remove it. It was one of my persons that works in compliance did, so I don't know the 100%. It was the picture of this and picture of that. All I was getting were bits and pieces of...
Well, you also were CC'd on those emails asking me to remove that 3% offering from seller to buyer too. So let me take you through the math. On this particular property on Corona, our asking price was $388,888. That is the nominal price. The seller offered 3% of that nominal figure, $11,666, to the buyer for their closing costs, or the buyer could have reduced it from the purchase price. If the buyer elected to reduce it from the purchase price, that would have dropped the real purchase price to $377,222. In other words, it would have made the home $11,666 less expensive. So when Intermountain MLS removed this concession from the seller to the buyer, they increased the real price of the home by $11,666. And that makes the home less affordable for a buyer. And if you think of it in terms of financing, say interest rates right now are around 7%. So on a 30-year loan, they're increasing the buyer's payment by like $75 a month for 30 years. That number is pretty astronomical. If you were to put it on a 15-year loan, then it increases the price over $100 a month.
Well, we're also leaving the commission and the public remarks. It goes out to all public sites, and then it's more of a series.
No. This wasn't a commission. This was a seller offered to pay buyer's closing costs or reduce the purchase price. Seller concessions have always been allowed in my 23-year career. I could find hundreds of places on MLS where a builder or a seller is offering to pay money to a buyer's closing costs.
Okay, I'm not told well enough to speak directly to that. It doesn't sound like that should have been. I mean, that shouldn't have been a part of the removal from what you're saying. And I'm certainly kind of hamstrung with a phone and no computer in front of me at this moment.
Okay.
But there was verbiage that needed to be removed.
Yeah, and you guys removed it.
We had to. I mean, it goes against the N.A.R rules, and that's what we have to.
Oh, so wait, hold on. You just said it goes against the N.A.R rule. So this is a N.A.R rule, not an MLS rule? Because are you referring to 1616 in the Code of Ethics from the National Association of Realtors? I am aware of that rule. Is that what you're talking about?
That's one of them. I thought there were two rules that were cited.
Oh no, I've never heard you cite an N.A.R rule, and I didn't know that MLS enforced N.A.R rules. I thought that was enforced through BRR or IAR.
No, it's enforced. MLS rules are brought down from N.A.R, and N.A.R says here are the model rules you need to run as an MLS, and we have to follow those. So
you're saying I violated a N.A.R rule, not an MLS rule?
We adopted it. It's both. It's a rule that was put down by N.A.R for MLSs to run by.
Okay, I'm confused.
And there's a lot of them. There's IDX rules. There's VAL rules. All those start at N.A.R, and N.A.R gives us a sample rule set. Because there are certain, not this, but there's certain areas in the rules where you can choose to do this or do that. But it all starts from N.A.R.
Oh, I know it all starts from N.A.R, and I know that.
So just know that we're doing everything we can to continue to advocate for your ability to help buyers, sellers, tenants, and landlords all across our great country.
The fact is the rule was broken, and we were trying to correct it. We don't want to charge money. We don't need them. We don't need the money for rules. We'd rather educate and have clean data.
I don't feel like I broke a rule, and I feel like the buyer and seller have the right to negotiate commission. I believe it's against federal law to restrict that. I do think that you also violated Idaho state law in interfering with the representation agreement that I had with my client. And I also think there, could potentially be antitrust violations here.
Hello members, I'm Lisa Martin, the Boise Regional Realtors CEO, and I want to encourage you today in the midst of the confusion as we navigate the N.A.R proposed settlement on the seller's class action antitrust suit and the proposed changes which will most likely prevail. The real estate industry has navigated many changes throughout the years, from mandatory disclosures to sub-agency, and even through what caused the 2008 market crash. Change comes. Our goal through providing you with this video is to help you successfully traverse new terrain. Your compassion, integrity, professionalism, and the commitment to education are what provide you with a unique edge to help consumers through one of the most nerve-wracking purchases some will make in their lifetime. Those things will not change even if the actual process does. Actions speak louder than words.
Now, on to the settlement.
We do not know if the settlement agreement will be approved by the court.
I just want to let you know there was no perfect option.
Nor do we know how N.A.R will implement its terms.
We have agreed to put in place a new MLS rule.
N.A.R. continues to deny any wrongdoing in connection with the MLS cooperative compensation model.
Together, we will figure this out.
So to be clear, nearly every realtor is covered by the release we negotiated.
Leadership across the board will be working in tandem to provide the best solutions for these new changes.
One of my favorite quotes when I am teaching classes, we don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. Arch Kalakis.
My advice to members is, rather than guess or try to predict the future, focus on what you can control. Remind your clients of your value, your principles, and your best practices.
The National Association of Realtors will continue in the same way that it has for 116 years, to serve its members.
Tell me how these different associations, National Association of Realtors, the state level associations, the regional associations, the MLS, really work together. They collude to, keep the consumer in the dark and without the ability to negotiate for themselves.
Yeah, I would almost think of like a Venn diagram where you've got the National Association of Realtors at the top, and they're writing the Code of Ethics and clear cooperation. So in the Code of Ethics, for example, there's a Rule 1616, which if you logically distill, essentially says the buyer and seller cannot negotiate commission on the purchase agreement. They're also doing other things, like they have a very large political action committee where they're lobbying at the federal, state, and local levels. And then you go down to the state associations where I live, Idaho Association of Realtors. They're the ones who create the purchase and sales agreement, which conspicuously leaves off the buyer and seller ability to negotiate brokerage fee. They also write the buyer representation agreement, which makes the buyer only able to negotiate a bottom level of commissions. Then you've got the Boise Regional Realtors or local associations. It's generally the same structure throughout the country, but where I live in the Boise Regional Realtors, they're gonna enforce the Code of Ethics. So if you step out of line on 1616, they're the police, they're gonna fine you. They're gonna, kind of go after your name for something like that. The Regional Realtors organization here owns the Intermountain MLS. And then they also weaponize their rules and their regulations, to keep people in line. And then outside of the National Association of Realtors collaborating with state and local associations and MLSs, you have agents who create policies where they charge a 6% brokerage fee. That's their personal policy. They'll charge the seller 3% to list, 3% on the buy side offered through MLS. And then if you go buy a home from them, they'll keep the entire 3% and then give you a fruit basket or something. Then you've got broker policies who do the same thing. Our brokerage policy is to charge 6%. Then you also have, agents and brokers trying to frame the narrative. Well, we're a full service broker. When we inside the industry know that means 6%. But for the consumer, they might think it's some extra type of service, or they might weaponize, they're a discount broker because they charge less than 6%, somehow insinuating that there's a lower level of service there. And then you have steering, where agents might push their buyers to certain listings. One pays $30,000 and the next door neighbor pays $20,000. And they're steering their buyer to the one that pays $30,000. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, you have this perfect intersection, a Bermuda Triangle kind of, where the buyer they don't have an ability to negotiate their commission. And the seller is really being forced to pay inflated brokerage fees that are pushing up towards 6%. And these things obfuscate the truth, and they also harm the buyer and seller from being able to negotiate brokerage commissions, thus lowering the cost of homeownership.
This is a literal train wreck.
This is a literal train wreck in real time. Damn, dude. This is a literal train wreck in real time. Please try and stay with me through this video, because I'm going to prove to you that beyond the preponderance of the evidence, and even beyond a reasonable doubt, that antitrust violations have occurred, racketeering exists, and the RICO statutes have been broken. Why does this matter? Because the collusion has made homeownership less affordable. It's deprived Americans of the American dream. It has deprived the buyer's ability to negotiate their broker's commission. The seller has been conditioned to believe that they need to pay an inflated 6% brokerage fee. And I'm going to show you exactly how this works.
Let's back up just a little bit. Why don't you just tell me, who are the players in all of this?
Okay, that's a great question, because not all real estate agents are realtors, right? I got my license right after college. I think it was 2003, and I became a realtor. I joined the National Association of Realtors, the Idaho Association of Realtors, and the Ada County Association of Realtors. In Boise, it's Boise Association, Idaho Association, National. And that it generally works like that throughout the country. N.A.R. is the National Association of Realtors. It's the largest trade organization in the country. I think there's over 1.5 million members now. IAR is the Idaho Association of Realtors. Probably the most important thing that they do is they write our purchase and sales agreements, and they also write our buyer and seller representation agreements. Now, they have attorneys on staff who write these, but those attorneys, are hired by the Idaho Association of Realtors, which is a trade organization. BRR is the Boise Regional Realtors. It was formerly called the Ada County Association of Realtors. When I was in my early 20s, I was actually the vice president of the Ada County Association of Realtors, which is now BRR. It's the largest local association in Idaho, so I think there's over 7,000 agents in our local association.
How are laws written statewide?
So most real estate laws are written at the state level. There are federal laws, right? Fair housing is a federal law. That's written by the federal government. States typically write real estate laws, so the state legislators will pass laws, and then the real estate commissions will enforce the laws. In Idaho, we have the Idaho Real Estate Commission. They enforce the state laws in Idaho. In Texas, you might have the Texas Real Estate Commission, who enforces Texas law. Because laws are typically written at the state level, licensing is also done at the state level. So my broker's license is through the Idaho Real Estate Commission.
Does federal law supersede the rules of real estate association?
Absolutely it does. I believe there's even something in the Code of Ethics that says if the National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics contradicts state or federal law, that state or federal law shall supersede it. Now, I can give you a personal example that is sad, but that where this is the case. So I once bought a duplex, and that duplex had CC&Rs, covenants and restrictions, that were written in the 1950s. And it said in there, no person other than the white race shall live here. And it makes me even sad to think about that, but that is obviously a federal law violation to have CC&Rs like that. And it was written in the 50s, so that, or I think it was the 50s, so it was prior to the federal law that those CC&Rs were written. And so federal law superseded that. I completely disregarded those CC&Rs when I saw them, because federal law supersedes CC&Rs. Likewise, federal law supersedes N.A.R. rules, MLS rules, Boise Regional Realtor rules. These are trade organizations. N.A.R., the California Association of Realtors, the Boston Association of Realtors, if there is one. They're trade organizations, and federal or state law supersedes them.
Now, under the National Association of Realtors, there is a code of ethics as a realtor that you have to adhere by. Talk to me just about what the code of ethics is.
Correct. And actually a little history on this. It started, I don't know, probably early 1900s, maybe around 1905. There was a lot of shadiness going on in real estate at that time. And the code of ethics was created. It wasn't called the National Association of Realtors at that time. There was a different name for it. But essentially they wanted to create an ethical code of conduct for real estate agents to abide by. It was a higher standard than state and federal laws. And that's what the code of ethics was originally created to do, is to be a higher moral compass than state and local laws.
Do you think about these code of ethics when you deal in real estate? And do you think that everybody kind of does that?
Oh, absolutely I do. Because as a realtor, I've read the code of ethics many, many times. And, if you break a rule in the code of ethics, then you can be punished by your local real estate association. So for example, Boise Regional Realtors could punish me for breaking a rule in the code of ethics, or Idaho Association of Realtors, I think. Different associations can punish you if you break the code of ethics. You agree to abide by the code of ethics. Now, I've never personally, ever in my career, had a violation of the code of ethics, but, you could have it. I did actually just get an accusation when I put this listing on from the largest broker in Idaho, the designated broker, accusing me of violating the code of ethics in this listing by giving the buyer the capability to negotiate the buyer brokerage fee.
Can I ask you, do you believe that that's a violation of the code of ethics?
No. I responded to the designated broker and asked if she could point specifically where in the code of ethics I violated it in my listing. Within that same brokerage, there's a Facebook thread talking about me, and I saw some screenshots of that. Tiger prop and about this listing. It brought up a lot of dialogue, but there was also some remarks. Somebody was saying, an individual at Silver Creek was saying that we need to flag this in the MLS. It's a violation.
Talk to me. Let's talk a little bit about the Sherman Antitrust Act. If for people that just may not know what that is, maybe just explain that.
Yeah, Sherman Antitrust, and I'm not an attorney, but it's essentially the laws that regulate free trade in the United States. Kind of like the monopoly laws. You and I can't, let's say you own a gas station and I own a gas station. we can't collude to set gas prices at $10 a gallon. That's against federal antitrust law and the Sherman Antitrust Law.
Talk to me about the DOJ settlement of 2020. What was that about?
Oh boy, that was a big one. So the DOJ did have a settlement with the National Association of Realtors in 2020. It's a very long story, but there was a couple things in there I thought were really interesting. One of them is the DOJ said that N.A.R. or MLSs could no longer hide commissions. What used to happen is we had these MLSs who would offer a unilateral offer of compensation. MLSs still offer a unilateral offer of compensation, but it used to be hidden. So say that there's a $500,000 house and the seller agreed to pay the buyer broker 3% or $15,000. That was hidden from the public. And the DOJ said, wait, you can't do that. After that happened, MLSs could no longer restrict the buyer agent compensation from the public view. So websites like Zillow started to show this pays a 3% brokerage fee, buyer compensation, or 2% buyer compensation. MLS could no longer hide that. Before that was hidden. I actually tried a long time ago when I was running my brokerage to show the brokerage fee on MLS, but rules prevented it where they would essentially shut my brokerage down and restrict access to MLS, essentially putting myself and our 25 agents out of business if we tried to show them. But after that DOJ settlement, that was no longer legal to hide the buyer compensation fee, so they started showing that.
How does that information really serve the buyer?
I think it's cool because for the first time since MLS had a unilateral offer of compensation, for the first time the buyer could see what it was instead of it being hidden from them. So I think that was kind of cool. So after the DOJ settlement, what happened is there was these lawsuits, Sitzer, Burnett, and Morrill versus N.A.R. These lawsuits were the first of their kind, class action lawsuits. What was unique about Sitzer Burnett is they argued that it is not legal for the seller to be required to pay for the buyer agent compensation. So prior to that time, MLSs were required to offer at least $1. And N.A.R. always said, we're not fixing prices, which they really weren't saying. They weren't saying you have to put 3% and it has to be 6%, 3% for the list, 3% for the buy. They never had that policy. However, they did say you have to put at least $1. And what Sitzer Burnett said was that, wait a minute, you can't require the seller to pay the buyer's agent, even if it's $1, because the buyer's agent's negotiating against the seller. So you can't require it. You could offer it, but you can't require it. When they won, that changed the entire landscape because the buyer agent compensation was turned from $1 to $0.
How about N.A.R's response, the article that came out that was quoted, the truth about the N.A.R. settlement?
Okay, I'm gonna have to read this.
Yeah, please do.
So on March 22nd, N.A.R. came out with a response to Sitzer Burnett because there has been a lot of misinformation on all sides of this. And it says, facts first. There's much the media has gotten wrong about N.A.R's settlement, which would require the association to pay $418 million over 4 years. Some outlets have suggested that N.A.R. previously set or guided commissions to a standard rate of 6%. I would say it's true that N.A.R. did not guide rates to be set at 6%. They've always stated that they're negotiable. However, a lot of brokerages have company policies. When I first got into real estate, I was working for the largest brokerage in the state. Our company policy was to charge a 6% brokerage fee. If you've ever read Gary Keller, the founder of Keller Williams, the millionaire real estate agent, he talks about how to make $1 million in real estate. by making 3% on the list side and 3% on the buy side of every transaction. That's 6%, right? So the public has a long time heard of people talking about 6% brokerage fees as a standard. There is not a standard. N.A.R. has never put a standard brokerage fee of 6%. So I do agree with what they say there. However, they then go on to say they are and will remain entirely negotiable between brokers and their clients. I would argue that real estate commissions have not been negotiable for the buyer. And the reason they have not been negotiable is because a complicated set of rules. You have N.A.R. rules, you have State Association of Realtor rules, Local Association of Realtor rules, MLS rules. You also have state laws and federal laws. And in order to be compliant, you have to be compliant with every one of those entities. So it used to be there were certain things in the code of ethics that did not want the buyers and sellers to negotiate commission on the purchase and sales agreement. I've never heard of a state or federal law that would say that you can't do that. I can't imagine why they would do that, because almost all of our contracts, the buyer and seller negotiate virtually every fee on the purchase agreement. Loan fees, is the buyer paying for it? The seller. Title fees, escrow fees, appraisal fees, HOA transfer fees. What one item is conspicuously left off all of these contracts almost, or at least all the ones I'm aware of, is the buyer broker fee. It's left off of the purchase agreement. Now in states like Idaho, the buyer can technically negotiate the fee through what's called a buyer representation agreement. Idaho is one of the states where we always sign buyer representation agreements. When I first started in real estate in the early 2000s, every single time I had a buyer, I signed a buyer representation agreement. That's not necessarily the case in a lot of states.
You were telling me about Tracy Casper. Will you just explain who Tracy Casper is and just what she wrote on LinkedIn as her quote-unquote an open letter to home buyers?
My next guest has a front row seat to that drama. Tracy Casper is president of the National Association of Realtors. This is also her first national interview since losing that court case over keeping commissions artificially high. Tracy, it's good to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you, Kelly. I really appreciate you having me on the show this morning.
I was thinking, you have more drama between what's going on at N.A.R., what's going on in the housing market, what's going on with commissions. This is you're in the middle of a hurricane. So maybe
So Tracy, I like Tracy Casper. I'll start there, but she's a real estate broker, and she was the president of the National Association of Realtors till early this year, actually. When all this was kind of going, she ended up stepping down, but she wrote an open letter to home buyers. In here it says, you've likely heard that sellers are no longer required to pay for your buyer professional representation. Here's the spoiler alert, they were not ever required to do so. That is false. For probably the first 20 years of my career, the seller was required to offer at least $1 of compensation to the buyer's broker. That's what Sitzer Burnett argued and won. And so that policy of removing the requirement for sellers to pay buyer's broker fee only changed recently. I actually didn't find out about it until a discussion after the Sitzer Burnett, after N.A.R. lost and all these Keller Williams and all these other brokers lost in Sitzer Burnett. I went to a discussion with Intermountain MLS. They brought their attorney there, and I asked him a question. I said, hey, if we can no longer require sellers to offer compensation to buyers brokers, yet MLS mandates that we put $1 in there, how can we protect ourselves from liability? I don't want to get sued as a broker, realtor, agent if, we're putting $1, and he said something that shocked me. He said, MLS doesn't require compensation. I didn't even know they changed the policy from $1 to 0 prior to that. So that is something that happened recently while Sitzer Burnett and the DOJ, investigate somewhere between the 2020 DOJ investigation and Sitzer Burnett or after. It's a recent thing that MLS compensation is now allowed to be 0. Another thing, this is very interesting. It says in here, in Idaho and many other states, buyer representation agreements stipulate what services your agent will provide, how much your agent charges, and the alternative ways you can pay us. In other words, you give us permission to be paid via an offer of compensation from the listing agent and or the seller, or you agree to pay us at closing from your own proceeds. Now that is true, and this is a very, very interesting point, because Tracy and I, both living in Boise, are both members of the National Association of Realtors, the Idaho Association of Realtors, and the Boise Regional Realtors. We both use the exact same purchase and sales agreements and buyer representation agreements. And what I'm going to show you is how the purchase and sales agreement and the buyer representation agreement prevent the buyer from negotiating the commission in Idaho. And this is, I think, similar structures in most states are structured in ways where the buyer can't really negotiate the commission. So I am looking at this form. It is called the RE21 in Idaho. It is a purchase and sales agreement between the buyer and the seller. The contract is written by the Idaho Association of Realtors. And if you were to go to page 5 of this contract, section 19, there are a bunch of checkboxes. And these checkboxes are a negotiation between the buyer and the seller on the purchase agreement of who pays for what. So, for example, it can say the buyer or seller pays for the appraisal or the appraisal reinspection fee, the closing escrow fee, the lender doc processing fee, the tax service fee, the flood certification fee, title fees, HOA fees, loan fees, etc. They attempt to negotiate it on that purchase and sales agreement so that there's a meeting of the minds between the buyer and seller. The buyer's paying for this, the seller's paying for that. But the point is, on this contract created by the Idaho Association of Realtors, that's our trade organization, all of these fees are negotiated on the contract except for one. Most expensive fee typically, which is the brokerage fee. And now I'm not saying that brokerage fees are set at 6%, but if a brokerage fee was 6%, a $500,000 listing, that's $30,000. On $1 million listing, that's $60,000. Why would you leave a $60,000 fee off of the purchase and sales agreement when the buyer and the seller are negotiating it, but you require the disclosure of a tax service fee that's like a few $100? It makes no logical sense. Now, there are rules through the Code of Ethics and N.A.R. that have tried to prevent or push compensation, brokerage fee compensation specifically off these contracts. I think what the goal was to have a unilateral offer of compensation through MLS. In other words, that means if you're showing one of my listings and my seller agreed to pay 3% on a $500,000 house, they agreed to pay your buyer's broker $15,000. They are entitled to a $15,000 brokerage fee. The brokerage is entitled to the fee, not the buyer, because this is a unilateral offer of compensation in MLS. And MLS and the associations require unilateral offers of compensation for buyer's agents.
How can buyers actually negotiate the buyer brokerage fee? Is that possible?
That's funny. I've thought about this for a long time, and back, I think around 2013 when I started Tiger Prop, I think we were the first brokerage in the state of Idaho to give buyers rebates.
Does your real estate agent have their picture plastered all over your for sale sign? Did they charge you a 6% brokerage fee to sell your house? And then after going through months and months of the buying and selling process, did they keep the entire brokerage fee and give you a fruit basket? Well, Tiger Prop is different. We refuse to charge our sellers 6% brokerage fees, and we give our buyers money at closing, not fruit baskets. In fact, Tiger Prop pays for professional photography, color flyers, and home staging consultations. Why? Because tigers hate fruit baskets. We are Tiger Prop, and we will save you thousands. Tiger Prop is a Boise-based company and is now hiring.
The way that we did this is, let's say that a seller offered our brokerage a unilateral offer of compensation of $50,000. We would give the buyer 20% of that. We would give them $10,000 as a rebate, and that would go right onto the closing statement. We're giving the buyer $10,000 to closing costs or prepaids. I couldn't say commission because the Idaho Association of Realtors and National Association of Realtors and the Boise Regional Realtors would not allow me to give a commission on the contract, but we worked around that by offering a rebate to closing costs and or prepaids, and we said it was a disclosure. There is also a disclosure on the contract if the seller is giving money towards the buyer's closing costs or prepaids, which is allowable, and it happens all the time where sellers might give a buyer $15,000 so they could pay their loan fees, their title fees, whatever. Idaho is one of the states that requires buyer representation agreements. And so if you're representing a buyer anyway, you have to have a buyer representation agreement in Idaho. So ever since I started my career, I always had buyers sign buyer representation agreements. I've literally I've had buyers review or sign thousands of these. Like I've written hundreds and hundreds, or as when I was the designated broker, I was responsible for reviewing all of my agents' files, and so I had to review all of the buyer representation agreements. Not every state requires buyer representation agreements, so sometimes that unilateral offer of compensation through MLS that I was talking about earlier is all they need. They don't even need a buyer representation agreement. In Idaho, we're required to have one. And but even though we're required to have a buyer representation agreement, I wouldn't necessarily say that the buyer can really negotiate that fee. And here is why. If you look at our standard form created by the Idaho Association of Realtors, and you go down to page 3, section 14, it talks about compensation of broker. And there's different check boxes, right? So if it's a for sale by owner, you could check one box and, someone has to pay you X dollars. Or if the property's leased, you could technically have landlord pay you. But the most important one that is used probably on 98% of buyer representation agreements is there's a line 129A. It says, if the property is subject to a listing agreement with the broker's company or a cooperating broker through the multiple listing service or otherwise, the fee will be the amount equal to the compensation offered by the aforementioned brokers, but not less than X. This is a box that real estate agents, realtors, will fill out on the I.A.R. form. So I've seen these before that say 0, not less than 0. So if a buyer's signing this, they're not gonna have to pay their agent anything. Let's say that it said not less than 3%. And let's say that MLS only offered 2. Well, then in that case, the buyer would have to make up the difference and pay the 1%, right? So a lot of agents, they're not going to ask the buyer to pay them. I've never asked the buyer to pay him if the seller paid less. I kind of felt guilty doing that. Like, let's say, you were hoping to get, 2.5% and they only paid you 2%. It's kind of a bummer, but I've never gone to the buyer and said, you owe me 0.5%. You could. But let's say that you put not less than 0. That means the buyer's not going to have to pay anything for their buyer's agent, right? However, what if it's $1 million house that the buyer's agent compensation is 3%? How much is that buyer's agent being paid? $30,000, not 0. The buyer representation, remember, says it's 0 in this instance. But the buyer's brokerage is being paid $30,000. The first time the buyer may even see this could be at the closing table when they're signing the settlement statements. So although it's technically negotiable, because of the wording of this, not less than X, buyers really don't know how to negotiate it. If it said not more than 1%, and let's say that the seller offered 3, then presumably 2 would go to the buyer. I've never seen that done in my career.
Let me ask you, is the buyer aware that they are really, that this price is likely kind of baked into the price of the home and technically they're paying that 3% to the buyer's agent? Or are they just kind of like, oh, I'm paying them nothing because the seller's paying it?
That's a very interesting point. So a lot of times realtors and buyer's agents used to say, my services are free. You don't have to pay me anything. Well, when the Department of Justice had that settlement in 2020, they said, you can't say your services are free if you're getting paid. So if you're getting paid, you can't say it's free anymore. So the narrative from National Association of Realtors and all of the other ones has switched. It used to be buyer's agents are free because the seller's paying for it. Now the narrative is, well, yeah, the buyer's paying for it. It's just kind of baked into the purchase price. If the seller's paying for it, yeah, technically the seller's writing the check, but it comes from the buyer.
Would you say that most buyers are aware that that's the case, or they're like, oh, I'm 0%. I'm not going to owe them anything, but really, are they aware of that?
I've always made my buyers aware of it because I always gave my buyers a rebate. And so I believed in being transparent. So if I got paid $10,000, my agreement was with my buyer was, I'm going to give you $2,000 of the $10,000. I'm going to give you 20% back instead of a fruit basket. Not all agents have that discussion with their buyers. Legally in Idaho, all they really have to do is fill out that buyer representation agreement. So if they put 0, I don't really think they would be violating any type of law if the seller was paying them, say, 3%, because in Idaho, you don't have to disclose seller to buyer compensation on a purchase agreement, and the only time you have to really disclose it if the seller and buyer are both paying somebody.
So it's a surprise for a lot of buyers then, the closing table, where they're like, oh, yeah. Gee, what?
Yeah, and my contention, and one of the problems I've always had with this, and I've been very outspoken in my views for the last decade, is that it should be disclosed to the buyer how much their agent is being paid. I think that disclosure should be there, 1. Number 2, I think it should be on the purchase agreement.
So I guess just pertaining to this listing that you just put up, how did you structure it? How did you structure that listing that gives that buyer, 1, the ability to negotiate compensation for the first time, and 2, I guess keeps you out of the sticks with all these different MLS associations rules,
Yeah.
Tell me.
So I think that the way I structured this listing, it's compliant with the National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics. It's compliant with Idaho Association of Realtors, Boise Regional Realtors. It's compliant with Intermountain MLS, although they're saying otherwise, but I haven't seen a valid reason why the listing's not compliant with MLS. You'll have to ask Intermountain why they think it's compliant. I think it's compliant with all of those things. And this is how I structured it. I went to my seller, I was talking to him, and happened to be a friend of mine. We were talking about the settlement, and I said, hey, I have an idea. I think we could structure this in a way where we could make an offering to the buyer that's never happened before. Why wait until July? Take advantage of the Department of Justice and class action settlements. You can be a part of history in what is likely the nation's first listing of its kind. Take an extra 3% off your purchase price, or use the money to pay your buyer's agent and/or closing costs. Seller to pay up to 3% towards buyer's closing costs, prepaids, buyer side brokerage fees, or purchase price reduction. Buyer's choice. We offered $0 to the buyer's agent as a unilateral offer of compensation. There's a field in MLS that says what is the compensation being offered. Rather than 3% or 2% or 1% or $1, we put 0. The seller made a unilateral offer of compensation to the buyer's brokerage of $0. However, in the remarks to the listing, the seller also made a offer of 3% of the purchase price towards the buyer's closing costs, brokerage fees, or reduction in price, the buyer's choice on whatever they wanted to do with those.
What happened? What I mean, like, where were you? Has it sat for the last couple of weeks, or what happened?
No, actually, we listed it on Thursday, put it under contract over the weekend. I can't really get into the details of exactly what happened, but I feel like it was a win-win-win situation for the seller, the buyer, and the brokerages. And I think what's really a win is the buyer had a choice. The buyer chose what they wanted to do.
Day 13, we're finishing this documentary. It's an hour long. I don't think we ever expected to do this. What do you want people who just finished watching this to take with them when they walk away from this screen that they're watching it on?
Yeah, I think mistakes were made in this industry, and the system was set up in a way that wasn't fair for the consumer. And I think as an industry, the leaders, the brokers, the real estate agents, we need to come together and admit our wrongdoings and try and make amends to the public. And I think we need to work together to set up a new system that is based on transparency and working together and putting protections in place for buyers and sellers to restore the dream of homeownership. And I think that, some people might say, well, you don't need a real estate agent, you don't need a realtor. I actually do think there's a need for real estate agents. A good real estate agent is like a generalist, and they know about title and escrow and loans and underwriting and processing. They know about planning and zoning and development. They know about construction, and there's this property has polybutylene piping. They know all these nuances that normal people might not know. And I think there is a place for this. And I think there's a place for real estate agents to represent sellers or to be buyers' advocates. And I'm not trying to advocate for that system to go away. What I'm advocating for is for truth and transparency and a level playing field to restore the American dream. And I really hope that just everyone can come together, not just leaders in the real estate industry, but government officials and leaders in the title industry and the finance, the loan industry. I hope that we can, and the public, and we can all come together and work, and even Republicans and Democrats, maybe they can reach across the aisle instead of pointing fingers at each other and be part of the solution. And that's what I hope for in my heart. I'm a real estate broker. I want to build Tiger Prop. I want to build Bid on Brokers. This isn't my dream to be a consumer advocate. I want to build businesses. And so I hope that here the baton passes to all of these other leaders, and I just hope that you can work together and create a better future for my kids and my grandkids. So thank you.